virtually anyone who defines themselves as part of the American Jewish community would probably agree that one of the boundaries that is almost universally held is the idea that Jews for Jesus are not part of the Jewish community. I'm offering that as a boundary. Boundaries are okay. We have the right to set boundaries on any topic. We have the right to set boundaries that define who we are as a community. And the notion, which is often suggested in this conversation, that we don't care about those people who will feel shut down or left out by the boundaries that the organized Jewish community sets in our conversation about Israel is somehow bad. We all recognize that when we set boundaries, including boundaries about the conversation about Israel, we run the risk of some people being left out who might have been in. That's a risk we understand, and yet we set those boundaries. So I would encourage you to respect the right that any community sets boundaries, including this one in this room, and that those boundaries are set by who you want here and who you don't. So it's a little weird for me to be up here as the so-called voice of an organized Jewish community because Boston is frankly different. And maybe it's because long before J Street came along, we embraced an approach to inclusive Jewish community, particularly with regard to interfaith families and LGBT Jews, that was more inclusive. Or maybe it's because we have an approach about our JCRC with clear norms. It's a separate 501c3. We have our own charter with a bylaws that clearly says what you get to do to get at the table. But at the end of the day, one way or another, and with a certain degree of messiness and controversy, and I'm happy to get into that later, in 2011, despite that process, and despite some mistakes by our own leaders, ultimately 120 of Boston's Jewish leaders voted that J Street should be at the communal table. Now let me tell you how we define the table. And it's in our bylaws, so it's very explicit. It's support for a secure, Jewish, and democratic state of Israel. And by and large, in Jewish communities around the country, organized Jewish communities, that's the boundaries. And that those boundaries may not be spelled out explicitly, but those are the boundaries. And then the question is how we define those boundaries and how we debate the definition of those boundaries. And for us in Boston, we define those as certain things that go beyond the table, such as support for tactics that challenge Israel's legitimacy, and frankly, those who place sole blame for the peace process on Israel through tactics like BDS. And so we have the right to set our boundaries, and we feel comfortable with boundaries that say that Jewish Voice for Peace doesn't belong at the table and isn't part of what speaks for the Jewish community, but that J Street is at the table in our community. So I'd like to move off of this question of boundaries for a few minutes and talk maybe about some of the challenges here, because this has been posited in the question of shutting down conversation about Israel. And I want to suggest to you that maybe possibly there are a couple of things that people within J Street and J Street leaders do that actually shuts down the conversation about Israel for you to think about. And I will tell you frankly that in the last couple of weeks, when it became known that I was on this panel, the most vociferous opposition to my being here today came from members of J Street, in fact, leaders of J Street. And that the people who some might portray as the most right-wing members of my community, when they asked me about my being here today, they were quite comfortable with my appearing here and talking to you, because they understand that we have a table and that J Street's at it. So let's take Boston for an example, even in Boston, where J Street is at the table, and talk about those actions which leaders do, which sometimes shut down the conversation about Israel. It could not be clearer in Boston that we support peace and a Palestinian state. We're one of the few local communities that issued not one, but several statements this summer around the peace process, and specifically in support of Secretary Kerry's efforts. Yet it often seems to many of my leaders, who certainly took the time to share their views again with me in the last few weeks, that it seems like J Street is more interested in regional peace than it is in Israel's security. And that's a challenging thing for us to deal with, and to listen to, and to include at our table. We're very frank about the fact that we believe in an approach to peace and achieving peace, or a role for the American Jewish community in that is primarily focused on engaging and persuading Israelis and their leaders about the necessity for peace. And frankly, when we see efforts that feel more like they are pressuring the American government or persuading the American government to pressure Israel, to push Israel into doing something that her or her people are not quite ready to do, that is at best distasteful to us. And not every organization who supports peace and two states engages that tactic, but it is a tactic that many of our leaders find distasteful. And it couldn't be clearer. If you haven't seen it last week, you should look at it in the JMS. There was a story about someone in our community who tried to go after Label Fine, who I think is here at this conference, for having made statements about his personal decision to boycott the settlement of Ariel. It couldn't be clearer that, at least in our community, we believe that debate about settlements is part of the communal conversation. And if you read the quotes from the CEO of our federation last week saying that the conversation about settlements, support for them, opposition to them, and how that happens are part of a healthy Jewish communal conversation, that's what we believe. But at the same time, it frustrates us when it seems, sometimes, that many people in the pro-Israel, pro-peace faction do not respect other people's attachment to those lands and to those settlements. It is painful to many of us who support peace and support two states that we will have to give up access to places where Jews have lived for thousands of years and where Jews were chased out in pogroms and riots not barely 100 years ago. It's painful for us, and we're ready to do that. And it would be nice if maybe some of you indicated some respect for that pain when criticizing us. So I'm going to challenge you that if J Street wants to be serious and sophisticated in joining a communal conversation about Israel and the peace process, I would ask you to recognize that we are serious about holding a range of politics and views within the organized Jewish community, and I'm happy to talk about CRCs and how we take positions or not. But that we hold that range and not just take one position, except when we define in the broadest sense what it means to support a Jewish, democratic, and secure state. I would challenge you to not be so dismissive of other views, to prove that you are willing to listen as much as you are to tell us what you believe. And maybe to have the humility to entertain the possibility that sometimes other people might know something that you don't know, or that you might be wrong about some things, and that even the possibility that the government of Israel and the people of Israel might know better what they think is best for their future than we do as American Jews. So I've opened up a lot of topics. I know I was put on this panel in an unusual position, and I want to say I can speak for Boston, but I do think those trends are true in most communities around the country. And when I talk to my colleagues around the country, these are the same questions that come up in lots of Jewish communities. And I think for us in Boston, we're serious about having a broad tent, so to speak, Jewish communal conversation. And I would encourage you to be serious as well. Thank you.